the leadership in Beijing has tried to change the shift in population decline in China for almost a decade now, with close to no results. There are already signs that the state of women's rights in China is worsening under Xi Jinping. There is the issue that the Chinese economy appears to be slowing its growth, and so the future is still very much uncertain.
China was known for decades for its one-child policy to limit population growth, but now the country is worried about its aging population and is looking for ways to boost the birth rate. But at what cost? For more about Beijing's struggles to reverse China's demographic decline, joining us now is Daria Impiombato. She's a senior researcher at Merics. Daria, thank you for joining us. Looking at population growth, it has slowed generally in the region. Taiwan, Japan, and the like in East Asia are projected to see an 11% population decline by 2050. Is the situation in China similar to that, or are there reasons specific to China?
There are definitely reasons specific to China, and the main cause of that is decades of the infamous one-child policy. Obviously, the leadership in Beijing has tried to change the shift in population decline in China for almost a decade now, with close to no results. And now they're sort of scrambling with the flush of incentives coming out this year. However, I think what is happening in China is predicted to be a much bigger crisis than in other countries.
So-called getting rich before getting old. It's always a big demographic talking point. Japan appears to have managed it, but will China do it?
There's another sort of side of the coin, the fact that China's GDP per capita is still much lower compared to other developed nations and sort of at similar birth rates at the moment. And there is the issue that the Chinese economy appears to be slowing its growth. And so the future is still very much uncertain.
There are no women in senior leadership roles in China, and women's rights have worsened under President Xi Jinping. What impact will population pressures have on women's rights?
There are already signs that the state of women's rights in China is worsening under Xi Jinping. Obviously, there have been incredible advancements and progress since 1995 for women, especially in China. But we have seen a huge shift towards more traditionalist values that see women back in the household and as family and child carers and elderly carers. This is key to achieve sort of higher birth rates, to kind of convince women again that they need to get married younger and have more children. But that is a terrible trade-off at the moment, considering the price of childcare and what it means for women for their career, especially.
You say convincing there, but I'm wondering, is there a danger that efforts to boost the population could result in coercive policies?
That is the big worry. We have already started seeing more invasive and coercive initiatives across some regions of China where, party officials call up women and ask about their plans to have children and sort of building additional pressures. But also in terms of the law, there have been some sort of worrying developments around abortion rights, where women need more and more sort of reasons and permission to get abortions. So this is something that definitely needs to be monitored.
I want to get into some of the specifics here within China, but stepping back first, what do you think will be the global impact of China's demographic challenges here?
Obviously, if the country takes a big downturn towards sort of worsening women's rights, it is a huge development for women's rights globally, and for the progress of women's rights more generally. But I think if the party state sort of fails to reverse this trend, which is really, really dipping at the moment, it could have huge impacts on China's economy, economic prospects, and sort of its prospects as a global superpower. And so, we talk a lot these days about this sort of shifting power dynamic, which see China in a very central role globally. But this might put a foot in the works really for Beijing.
I couldn't help but wonder with such a large country like China if there were specific targets for boosting the population within the country, maybe certain regions, economic groups, or is it literally anyone who could have kids, the government wants there to be more children?
There is this talk and a sort of focus on good quality population. Like obviously China wants to maintain its achievement with education and with urbanization and sort of progress on those sides as well. So having a big boom of births, for example, in rural areas wouldn't be as easy to manage, especially because there are still very lacking services in terms of maternity health, child health, and childcare. And this is proving to be a very difficult balance to maintain, because the government does want to promise better services, but at the same time, those services are shutting down because there are just not enough children.
It does seem quite expensive to raise a child in China, especially given the highly competitive nature of the education system. What kind of incentives are you seeing or can we expect?
So we are seeing huge rollouts of incentives in terms of cash handouts. These were present already in some regions, and in some regions, for example, like in Mongolia, they were way more generous than others. The one that's been rolled out nationally is quite small, especially looking at urban populations. It doesn't really make a dent in the huge expenses that families have to face to raise children. However, since September, China started rolling out national free childcare, public childcare. It's a phased rollout, but that was a quite welcome change. However, the overall cost of education across the sort of child and person's lifetime is still huge and much higher than many other developed countries.
I'm wondering about the uptake of some of these incentives. Essentially, is it enough? Because if you're looking at South Korea, for example, there have been various government pledges that are worth sometimes thousands of euros, and even employers are pledging money to employees who have kids. And from what I gathered, it seems like the nationwide child subsidy from China is only worth about 430 euros. So compared to other incentives elsewhere in the region, countries dealing with the same issue, I couldn't help but wonder, is this enough money to convince skeptical parents, potential parents?
It is not enough, sort of from even just looking at the numbers, but if you go on Chinese social media, you can see that people are almost mocking some of the incentives, saying, as if that will convince anyone to get married or have a child. It still just doesn't barely cover. I think in some parts of China, there were estimates that it would cover just one extra can of milk formula a month. So not really enough. And I think it's also, these cash incentives are not addressing some core fundamental issues that are structural and that remain, and is particularly around female employment and discrimination in the workplace for working mothers and prospective mothers. There is this strong sense that companies, because they have to sustain the bill of maternity leave and all that, they're already struggling with a slowing economic growth. They're just not hiring women who either have small children or they think they're going to have them soon. And this is a huge step back for women's labor rights.
Is there any moves from the government to potentially limit that kind of discrimination or hiring skepticism, if we're going to put it generously, towards employers within China? Because that would seem to counter this push towards young families to have more kids.
There is some push on the rhetoric side of things, sort of saying that, both men and women have to sort of carry the burden of raising a child, but that has done really not much to change social dynamics. It would take a very long time to change that. And in the end, in practice, government companies need money, and the government is not giving the companies enough support to provide enough maternity leave, to provide paternity leave, which in many cases still doesn't exist, and just like pretty much give families the support that they would require to have more children that the government wants.
I'm wondering what impact the shift from population control, also known as the one-child policy, has been in this situation where the government's now trying to boost population growth on Chinese citizens. Essentially, in the echoes of this policy, are average Chinese citizens skeptical?
Absolutely. I think there is still a lot of trauma being carried, especially by women. If you have gone through a forced abortion or forced sterilization against your will, you won't forget that very quickly. And now this sort of 180, a complete reversal, is creating a lot of frustration that is quite evident online. And even if not super directly, I think a lot of people just don't see things changing in the short term. It's just not convenient. People also just want different things compared to 2 or 3 decades ago, and that's going to be some really hard convincing to do.
I found it quite ironic that even though the government is looking to boost birth rates, that it does seem like there are still legal limits to how many children couples can have. Why not just lift that limit altogether?
Yeah, that is a really good question. It's sort of like a reflexive muscle for the Chinese Communist Party, the party state, to never let loose of control too much. I think that they're looking at sort of party documents. The reasoning behind that is that you still want to avoid a population boom and just excessive births, which sounds insane looking at where the numbers are today and where the trajectory is going. But that's still a sort of paranoia that they have. So I don't see that changing very soon.
In one of the graphs in your study, there was a look at 55,000 college students, and a third of young women said they didn't want to have children, that they did not want any kids. That seems incredibly high, and it was interesting, too, how it was twice as high as the number of young men. What do you interpret as the broader social issues at work here?
Well, I think young women are still very aware that despite the slowly changing rhetoric, they still will have to carry all the burden of having the children and having to look after sometimes, 4 parents, like theirs and their spouses and even grandparents sometimes. And that's a huge burden to carry. These are college-educated women with big dreams. When they were growing up, they were probably only children, and they were told they were as worthy as their male counterparts, and that they could do anything they wanted. Women in STEM and all those initiatives, and now that's what they want. So to just change the narrative suddenly and say, actually, you have to get married young now, forget about your dreams and go back to the household and your, sort of care duties or your primary duties, it's not sticking. And I think it's really telling that they feel free to say so. People always ask me, are these surveys in China even accurate? Because people don't feel free to really express their true opinion if it's against government directives. But clearly they do. The government is interested in understanding why, even though the reasons are quite obvious and have been stated plainly, but the changes are slowly to come.
But looking at the unemployment rate among younger people, I'm surprised that young men aren't feeling the pressure of potentially providing for a family in this kind of economic environment.
I think men's numbers are still quite low in terms of those who want to have more than one or two children. In broad terms, they're definitely higher, much higher than women's. Obviously, men have a much better time in the workplace. They don't face the same level of discrimination. However, I think across young populations, like sort of young brackets of the population, there is this sense of unrest, internal unrest in a way, because it's quite a contradiction. People can't find jobs. Even recent graduates, there are huge and growing rates of youth unemployment in cities across China. So the fact that the government is saying we need more children to boost the economy in the future is a big contradiction, because people are like, what are my children going to do? Even I can't find a job. They're not going to be able to get an education and find a job. So why would I do that? What prospects do my children have? I think that has a huge impact.
You mentioned the future, and there is widespread mechanization in Chinese manufacturing. And I'm wondering if, looking to the future, could that offset the impact of slower population growth on the workforce?
I think it really depends on how much of a tech optimist you are when answering this question. Definitely a lot of tech CEOs make huge promises about the impact of AI and automation. And I think the party state does hope that technology will solve a lot of its problems. I think it is too soon to tell. I found it actually quite disturbing to see a lot of talk around, for example, robotic wombs and what, you know, this sort of artificial way of creating human life might mean for population prospects. In my personal opinion, I don't think they will solve a huge decline in the population.
Daria Impiombato from Merics, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.